What's good, everybody? This is Wanda Dubey and welcome back to the channel. Growing and Shrinking, Flexbox Foundation, the next chapter after the previous one. So without wasting any time, let's dive into introduction. Let's look a little closer at what actually happened when you put flex 1 on those flex items in the last lesson overview. This section contains a general overview of topics that you will learn in this session. You'll learn 3 properties that are defined by flex shorthand and how to use them individually. Flex shorthand. The flex declaration is actually a shorthand of 3 properties that you can set on flex item. And these properties affect how flex items size themselves within their container. You've seen some shorthand properties before, but we haven't officially defined them yet. Shorthand properties are CSS properties that let you set the value of multiple on other CSS properties simultaneously. Using a shorthand property, you can write more concise and often more readable style sheets. So in this case, flex is actually a shorthand for flex, grow, shrink, and flex basis. So in the above screenshot of we can see div is written as flex 1. So in the above screenshot, flex equates flex grow 1, flex shrink 1, and flex basis 1. Very often you see the flex shorthands defined with only one value. In that case, the value is applied to flex grow. So we put 1 on our divs. We were actually specifying a shorthand of flex 110. For interactive explanation and demo, check this out. Let's watch the video.
Hey, in this lecture you're going to learn about the flex property, which allows you to set the width of the items according to the width of the entire container, meaning that they will become responsive. That's unlike our current items, which stay the same regardless of the width of the container. So if we want all of these items to stretch across the entire container and grow and shrink with it, we'll simply target the items with dot.
Let me just play it in full screen.
Hey, in this lecture you'll simply target the items with dot container. Select all the direct children, which also are divs, and then give them a flex property of 1. And as you can see, they now take up an equal amount of space, a third each, and they grow and shrink with the size of the container. Now, there's a little bit of magic here, as flex is actually a shorthand for 3 other properties. They are flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. However, I don't want to dwell about this now, because I think there are other parts of Flexbox that are more important to learn before you jump into understanding these 3. So we'll start by using flex the easy way, and then in a later screencast, I'll explain these 3 in depth. But for now, I'll just keep them here to remind you that this is a shorthand. Now, setting flex to 1 is much better than the old way of doing it, where you'd probably set the width to a percentage, like this. Example still works. However, now you have to change this number whenever you wanted to add a new item in the container. Whereas with flex, you can simply add as many items as you want, and Flexbox will take care of doing the maths for you and making all of them responsive. So let's actually try that out. We'll turn on the flex again, and let's simply add a 4th item here. We'll call it profile. Let's run the code. And as you can see, Flex automatically allocates space for all of the items according to how we've specified it here. Now each of them take up 25% of the width, and they grow and shrink with the container. We can also target specific items. Let's say that, for example, we want the search item here to be twice as wide as the rest of the items. Then we'll simply do container
on
search and set flex to 2. As you can see, it's now twice as wide as the 3 other items. The reason I'm specifying container and then the child of that container, which have the class of search, is because doing just dot search wouldn't work, as this selector here is more specific than this one, and that's how CSS works. If this one is more specific, given that it has both a class name and tag name, its styling will be prioritized above the less specific styling added here, as that's only using just the class name. So let's use both dot container and the child of the container as the class of search. So that was just a little digression about CSS selectors. So while this example here is nice for learning, I can say that I very often use this way of creating layouts where all of the items are 1 and then some of them are 2 or 3 or whatever. What I've found to be a more realistic use case is to have one of the items doing all the flexing while the others stay at a fixed width. And we can achieve that by simply removing the flex 1 on all the items except the search. Now, as you can see, the home, logout, and profile have a fixed width, while the search item is growing and shrinking with the width of the container. And now we can also remove the specification here and just use dot search. Okay, now I want to give you a little task. And before that, I'm going to remove this profile item so that we only have 3. Now, as you can see, the search in the middle does all the flexing, while the home and logout are fixed width. What I want you to do now is to make this layout do the exact opposite, meaning that the search item will have a fixed width, while the home and the logout will grow as you widen the container. So pause the screencast and do that, and when you come back, I'm going to show you how I would do it. Okay, so hopefully you...
Okay, that's pretty simple. You just have to use log out flex2, and that's how you're gonna do it. Yep.
Pause the screencast and did that for you how I changed. When this is the only item doing the flexing, it doesn't matter if this is 1 or 2 or 100 or 1,000 or whatever you want, and therefore I think it's easiest to just have it as 1. Now we also have to give the same behavior to the logout item, so I'll simply do logout, and just as that, we have both the home and the logout item growing and shrinking, while the search has a fixed width. Now, I really don't know why you would create a layout like this, but this is at least how you would do it. And that...
Sure thing. All right, that's like pretty good. Now, flex grow accepts a single number as its value, and that value is used as flex item grow factor. And we apply flex 1 to every div inside our container. We are telling every div to grow the same amount. The result of this is that every div ends up the exact same size. If we instead add flex 2 to just one of the divs, then the div would grow to 2x the size of another. If you remember, and if you have watched the previous video, then you might know what we are talking about. In the previous video, we have already created a layout where in the bottom of the web page we try to create those blue footers where the center footer was twice the length of the side containers. So if you want to check that, you can check the previous video and then maybe come back. Flex shrink is similar to flex grow, but it's the same shrink factor of a flex item. Flex shrink only ends up being applied if the size of all flex item is larger than their parent container. For example, if our 3 divs from above had a width declaration like 100 pixels and flex container was smaller than 300 pixels, our div would have shrink to fit. The default shrink factor is flex shrink 1, which means all the items shrink evenly. If you don't want an item to shrink, then you can specify flex shrink 0. You also can specify higher numbers to make certain items shrink at a higher rate than normal. Here's an example. Note that we have also changed the flex basis for a reason that we'll be explaining shortly. If you shrink the browser, you'll notice that 2 never gets small. Than the given width of 250 pixels, even though flex grow rule the flex grow rule would otherwise specify that each element should be sized equally. Now, an important implication to notice here is that when you specify flex grow or flex shrink, flex items do not necessarily respect your given values for width. In above example, all 3 divs are given a width of 250 pixels, but when their parent is big enough, they'll grow to fit. Likewise, when the parent is too small, the default behavior is for them to shrink to fit. This is not a bug. It could be confusing behavior if you are not expecting it. Flex basis simply sets the initial size of flex item. So any sort of flex growing or flex shrinking starts from baseline's size. The shorthand value defaults to flex basis 0%. The reason we had to change it into auto is that flex shrink example is that the base is set to 0. These items would ignore the item's width and everything would shrink evenly. Using auto as a flex basis tells the item to check for the width declaration. Important note about flex basis. There's a difference between the default value of flex basis and way the flex item shorthand defines it. If no flex basis is given, the actual default value of flex base is auto. But when you specify flex 1 on an element, it interprets as flex 110. If you want to only adjust an item's flex grow, you can simply do so directly. Without the shorthand, you can be more verbose and use the full 3 values shorthand. 1 auto, which also is equivalent to using flex auto. What is flex auto? If you notice, we have mentioned a new flex shorthand, flex auto. In the previous note, however, we fully didn't introduce it. Flex auto is one of the shorthands of flex. When auto is defined as a flex keyword, it is equivalent to the value of flex grow 1, flex shrink 1, and flex basis auto, or to flex 1 auto using the flex shorthand. Note that flex auto is not the default value when using the shorthand despite the name being auto, which may be slightly confusing at first. You'll encounter and learn more about flex auto and its potential use case. In practice, you will likely not use complex values for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. Generally, you're more likely to use declarations like flex 1 to make divs grow evenly and flex shrink 0 to keep certain divs from shrinking. It is possible to get fancy and the setup layouts where some columns relate to each other in specific ratio. So it's useful to know that you can use other values, but those are relatively rare. Now comes the assignment part. Go through this NW3.org's documentation on basic values of flex. So we have flex initial equivalent to flex auto. This is the initial value. Size is the item based on the width height properties. If the item's main size property completes the auto, this will size the flex item based on its contents. Make the flex item inflexible when there is positive free space, but allows to shrink. Flex auto equivalent to flex 1 auto sizes them items or sizes item based on width height properties, but makes them fully flexible so that they absorb free space along the main axis. Remember, main axis is our x-axis. All items are either flex auto initial or none. Any positive free space after the items has to be resized and distributed evenly. So that's the flex basis. Then there is flex shrink property, there's flex basis property, there's alignment, there's now I guess let's go through this example first. One use of auto margin in the main axis is to separate flex items into distinct groups. The following example shows how to use this to reproduce common UI pattern, a single bar of actions with some align on left to right. So nav and inside UL display is equals to flex and margin left auto. The figure explains the illustrations of how illustrates the difference in cross alignments in overflow situations between using auto margins and using alignment properties. Axis alignment, the justify content property, flex start, flex between. We already know this. Cross axis alignment, that's align items. Flex start, flex end, flex center, flex stretch to complete everything, and flex baseline. Then for the single we have align content property. So align content is aligns a flex container's line with the flex container where there is extra space in the cross axis. Aligns individual items within the main axis. Note that this property has no effect on single line flex container values. Oh, so align content property is that kind of property where we take this, we have different flex containers and we generate the that's for the flex containers once and for all. Flex container baseline, flex layout algorithm, initial setup, main size determine. Oh well, we don't need that, that's too much of an info. MDN docs summarizes this. MDN docs summarizes the entire flex shorthand value as well as introduces some new syntax that hasn't been covered in the previous article, so let's go through this as well. The flex CSS shorthand property sets how a flex item will grow and shrink into its space. Flex 1, flex 2, will grow twice. So the auto won't work. Flex shrink, flex shrink auto. Well, we have flex grow, and then we have flex basis. Okay, so we have flex syntax, flex auto, flex initial, flex none, and flex 2. There's em percentage min content. We have one valid value for flexbox values, flex 1 auto flex grow. For the most purpose, the authors should set flex to one of the following value: auto initial none, and provide buzzer to see the effects. Auto initial auto none, initial 4 to 1. Perfect. We have formal definitions. Then browser compatibility, we have browser compatibility, and that's too much of an info once again. Like for the basic requirements, you don't need to work it up so much. The CSS trigger, how individual flex grow, shrink, and basic property in detail. Let's go through this. Understanding flex grow, shrink, and flex basis. When you apply CSS property to an element, there's a lot of happening under the hood. So for example, let's say we have an HTML like this, so display flex, and these are technically not the only styles we are applying when we write that one line of CSS above. A whole bunch of properties will be applied to the following. So default value of flex, that's weird. Why do these elements have extra styles applied to them even we didn't write the code? Well, that's because some properties have default that are then intended to be overridden by us, and if we don't happen to know these styles are being applied when we are writing C, layouts can get pretty darn confusing. So flex property above is what's known as CSS shorthand property, and really this is doing a set of 3 separate things, separate CSS properties at the same time. So what we wrote above is the same as writing this flex grow 0, flex basis 1, and flex shrink 1. So a shorthand property bundles up a bunch of different CSS properties, make it easier to write multiple projects at once. Precisely like background property, where we can write something like this: URL top center no repeat fixed padding. Oh, perfect. I try to avoid shorthand properties because they can get pretty confusing, and I often tend to write longhand versions just so that my brain fails to pass long lines of values. It's recommended to use the shorthand when it comes to Flexbox, which is weird that until you understand this. The flex property is doing a lot of work, and each of its sub properties interact with each other. Also, the default styles are good thing because we don't need to know what these Flexbox properties are doing 90% of the time. For example, when I use Flexbox, I tend to write something like this: parent flex justify content displays equals to flex. I need to care. I don't even need to care about the child element or what styles have been applied to them. That's great. In case we are aligning the child's item side by side and then spacing them equally with each other. 2 lines of CSS gives you a lot of power here, and that's the neatest thing about Flexbox and these inherited styles. You don't have to understand all the complexities under the hood if you want to do if you want to do same thing 90% of the time. It's remarkably smart because all of the complexities is hidden out of you. But whatever you want to understand how Flexbox, including flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis properties actually work, and the cool thing is what we can do with them. Just go to the CSS tricks almanac. Done. And what's this link? Just kidding. Let's Oh, just let's start with a quick overview that's a little bit simplified and return a default flex properties. I hate it. So CSS tricks. Just let's start with a quick overview that's a little bit simplified and return to default flex properties that are applied to child elements. Alright, these default styles are telling the child element to how to stretch and expand. But whenever I see it being used or overridden, I find it helpful to think of these shorthand properties like flex, grow, flex string, min, max, ideal size. Oh, min, max, ideal size. Oh, okay. Oh my God, I got it. I just got it. That's why it's very important to read multiple articles. That's the first value of flex, grow, and it's set to 0 by default. We don't want our element to expand at all most of the time. The 0 1 1. Instead, we want every element to depend on the size of the content within. Here is an example: parent display flex, child, this is some long content, and child. I've added the content editable property to each dot child element, so that you can click into it and type even more content. Oh, got it. That's the default behavior of Flexbox item. The flex grow is set to 0 because we want the elements to grow based on the content inside it. But if we were to change the default of flex grow property from 0 to 1, flex child auto 1. This is the exactly same as writing as child flexbox grow 1 and ignoring other values because those might have been set to default by anyway. I think this is confused me for such a long time. When I started working with flexible layouts, I would see that would add just flex go property and wonder where the other styles are coming from. It was like an infuriating murder mystery that I couldn't find out. Now we want to make one of these elements grow more than the others. We just need to write following, or you could just write this: flex grow 3. It is weird to even look at even a decade after Flexbox landed in our browser. It is certainly for me. I need extra brain power to say max min ideal size when I'm reading the shorthand. But it gets easier over time. Anyway, in the example above, the first two child elements will take up proportionally the same amount of space, but the third will try to grow up 3 times the space as others. Now if now this is where things get weird, because this is all dependent on the content of the child elements. Even if we set flex grow 3 like we did in the example above and then add more content, the layout will do something odd and peculiar like this. The second column is now taking up too much dance space. We'll come back to this later, but for now it is important to remember that the content of flex item has an impact on how flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis will work together. Okay, so now for flex shrink, remember that's the second value of shorthand. Flex shrink tells the browser that the minimum size of element should be. The default value is 1, saying take up the same amount of space all the time. However, if we set the default value to 0 like this, then we are telling the element not to shrink at all. Now stay the same size. You blasted element is essentially what the CSS says, and that's precisely what it will do. We'll come back to this property in a bit once we look the final value in shorthand. Flex basis is the value that's added by default in the flex shorthand, and it's how we tell the element to stick to an ideal size. By default, it is set to auto, which means use my height or width. So we can set a parent element to display flex. We'll get this by default in the browser. Notice how all the elements are the width of their content by default. That's because auto is saying that the ideal size of our element is defined by its content. To make all the elements take up full space of the parent, we can set the child elements to width 100%, or we can set the flex basis to 100%, or we can set flex grow to 1. Let's go through this once again. Notice how the elements are taking elements are the width of their content by default. That's because auto is saying the ideal size of our element is defined by its content. To make all the elements take a full space of the parent, we set the child elements to width 100%, or we can set flex basis to 100%, or we can set flex grow to 1. Does that make sense? It's weird, huh? It does when you think about it. Each of the shorthand values impact the others, and that's why it is recommended to write shorthand in the first place rather than setting these values independently of one another. What we are telling the browser here is to set the flex basis to 1000 pixel, or please just try to take up 1000 pixels of space. If that's not possible, then the element will take that much space proportional to other elements. You might notice that on smaller screen, this third element is not actually 1000 pixels. That's because it's really a suggestion. We still have flex shrink applied, which is telling the element to shrink or to the same size as the other element. Also, adding more content to the other children will still have an impact here. Now, if we wanted to prevent this element from shrinking at all, we would write something like this. Remember, flex shrink is the second value here, and setting it to 0, we are saying don't shrink ever, you jerk. So it won't. The element will even break out of the parent element because it will never get shorter than 1000 pixel wide. Now, now all these changes, if we set flex wrap to parent element, so we'll see something like this. Okay, this is because the default flex items will try to fit into one line, but flex wrap will ignore that entirely. Now if those flex items can be fit in the same place, they'll break onto new line. Anyway, this is just some of the ways in which flex properties bump into each other. That's why gosh darn valuable to understand how these properties work under the hood. Each of the property can affect the other, and if you don't understand how one property works, then you sort of don't understand how any of it works at all, which certainly confuses me before I started digging into this. But to summarize, try to use flex shorthand. Remember max, min, ideal size when doing so. Remember that the content of an element can impact how these values work together too. Watch this interactive screen for let's just watch this video as well.
Sometimes it's magical and it just works and does what we want it to, and other times it doesn't quite do exactly what we ask. It starts doing some strange things, and it can be hard to understand exactly why. You start throwing some alignments or justifications on things to try and get things to behave the way you want them to, and that doesn't work exactly how you need, so maybe a grow here or a shrink there will do the job. Or what about a flex basis? But I mean, what is flex basis anyway? Well, in this video, I want to simplify Flexbox as much as possible with some realistic situations that we can use it in to really understand what's happening. So then you can flex shrink. Let's turn it off.
So let's maybe dive this into a little bit later. First of all, let's watch this video.
Hey there, in this lecture, we're going to take a deep dive. Flex is actually a shorthand property for 3 other properties. 3 flex shrink. Now copy that over here. Now
I mean, that's the same thing which we just studied above. So I think that it is a good place to wind up the video. In the additional resources, there's a YouTube video link. Make sure to, I mean, due to copyright issues, I won't be going through it in front of the video. So what I suggest you is maybe go through this video. I'll link it down, or maybe link this page, and you can just redirect yourself to that. Yeah, so that is it. And in this video we learned about the flex property. So flex, in which we had 3 different properties. We had flex, grow, shrink, and base. So I'm sure that you might got a hang of it. I'll have to revisit this topic once again to make myself clear. Alright, so that is it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, have a great day.